Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome on a very warm summer's evening to the Methodist Justice Lecture. My name is Rachel Lampard and I'm a former Vice President of the Methodist Conference. This is the first in what we hope will be a tradition of lectures, focusing on the challenges and calling to justice. And it's hard to begin with much bigger than a former Prime Minister. And we are just delighted that former Prime Minister Gordon Brown is going to be our lecturer this evening. This first Methodist Justice Lecture also sees the launch of a new project. This project is called Walking with Micah, Methodist Principles for Social Justice. And it's about helping the Methodist Church to explore what it means to be a justice-seeking church. It's hard to escape the call to justice in the Bible. The project takes its title from the prophet Micah, who reminds us that God calls us to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. The Methodist Church has a long tradition of being involved in justice issues, from founder John Wesley's opposition to the slave trade, to the witness of the Tolpuddle martyrs and the early trade union movement, to the many Methodists who've been in Parliament. And Methodists today are often acting for justice as part of their walk with God, supporting community fridges, helping and advocating for refugees, writing to their MPs and organising in their communities. Today, Methodists describe ourselves as being committed to a growing, inclusive, evangelistic, justice-seeking way of being church together. Walking with Micah is a 2-year project that will listen, ask questions and reflect on what it means to be a justice-seeking church today. If you're interested in being part of it, can I encourage you to visit the Walking with Micah website and sign up for emails to find out more. It's brilliant that we've got so many people who've joined us tonight. About 1,200 people signed up for tickets, Methodists and friends from all faiths and none. You are very welcome. If you're tweeting during the lecture, please do make use of the hashtag Methodist Justice Lecture. The lecture is going to last about 30 minutes. Mr. Brown has very kindly pre-recorded the lecture for us. I suspect this decision was born of previous experience of dodgy internet connections. But after the lecture, Mr. Brown will be taking questions. So could I ask you to submit any questions through the Q&A function? Don't feel you need to wait to the end. You can start submitting them as soon as you wish. So now I'm very pleased to introduce the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Hustler, the Secretary of the Methodist Conference, who is going to welcome Mr. Brown. Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Good evening. It is a very great pleasure to be able to welcome the Right Honourable Gordon Brown to give this first Methodist Justice Lecture to mark the launch of the Walking with Micah project. Mr. Brown needs little introduction. Entering Parliament in 1983, he served on the opposition front bench before becoming Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1997, a post he held for 10 years. He was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 2007 to 2010. His political achievements during those years in government witness to his commitment to social justice, from the introduction of Sure Start and the minimum wage, to his commitment to international aid and the cancelling of the debts of the poorest nations. His work has recognised that economic and financial levers can be used for social justice in the United Kingdom and globally, but also that there is a broader picture. His commitment to implementing the decisions of the 2009 Copenhagen Conference on Climate Change and his most recent work as United Nations Special Envoy on Children's Education point us to a world in which every life has value and all people can flourish. That is a vision which the Methodist Church shares and is at the heart of our Walking with Micah project. I am therefore delighted to introduce this lecture and hand over to Mr. Brown to speak to us on justice and hope.
Let me congratulate not just those present this evening, but the whole membership of the Methodist Church, not just on your past and present contribution to our country's progress, but also on your vision for the future. A vision inspired by justice, dignity, and solidarity, a vision driven forward by your beliefs that your mission is to the world, and a vision which contains a demand of great moral force to combat poverty, pollution, weapons proliferation, showing, true to your history, what faith can achieve in a post-COVID globe. And let me start by also acknowledging the inspiration I've drawn for this short talk from the historic achievements of the Methodist Church over the centuries. From John Wesley's work on social reform and prison reform and dealing with the social disruption of the Industrial Revolution and the role that the church has played in the abolition of the slave trade, right through to Methodist leadership in promoting today fair trade, international development, debt cancellation, and now your work with the new 12 million strong UK social movement, Crack the Crisis. As a church, you led the way on gender equality, ordaining the first women presbyters nearly 50 years ago in 1974. You also led the way on racial justice long before the Race Relations Act. Social justice, economic justice, racial and gender justice, and now environmental justice, all at the heart of your mission. I, for one, believe that the greatest movements for social change in history, 200 years ago, that abolition of slavery, 150 years ago, the emancipation of the working classes, 100 years ago, women's rights, 50 years ago, the rights of the disabled, and indeed all minorities since, all these movements have been built on ethical foundations, inspired by men and women of religious faith. So when we talk about the role of faith in politics, let me say, you should be proud that it's your church and sister churches that created much of the momentum in recent decades in Band-Aid, Make Poverty History, Jubilee 2000, to answer in a modern way the injunction of Isaiah that we should loose the chains of injustice and let the oppressed go free. And you should be prouder still that your efforts did change the world, and that because of your voice, there are men, women, and children whose names you will never know, whose faces you will never see, but who are alive today, are educated today, are in employment today, enjoy better health today, and a cleaner environment today because of what you have done. Every day through the generosity of your membership and your work in the field. And I praise all we can, the Methodist Development Charity, and your involvement, recognizing our responsibilities to the planet in the youth campaign, Climate Justice for All, and other environmental campaigns. Every day you show by your faith, by example, by inspiring others, the good that can result when people of moral purpose come together. And I want to praise also the contribution of your joint public issues team, working with the other non-established churches, including the Church of Scotland, of which I'm a member, for the shared objectives that you bring to bear. And now, as your new initiative rightly emphasizes, we face an even greater set of challenges. They are medical, economic, social, and cultural. We have to radically change our unfair, divided, poorly managed global order, whose leaders all too often forget that the real enemy is not another country. The real enemy is poverty, deprivation, disease, illiteracy, pollution, and squalor. In 1962, President Kennedy told America it should complement its Declaration of Independence with a global declaration of interdependence. And the question now is how our interdependence as a world, our openness and our interconnectivity, which by our mistakes became a liability, a channel through which disease and recession spread at speed across the world, can instead become what it should be, an asset, our interdependence, the platform for the international cooperation we need, and through which we transcend the I, me too, I want it now, selfish individual interests, and think of the power of us, our responsibilities and obligations to each other, remembering that every single faith we know of, without exception, Judaism, Hinduism, Islam, Sikhism, as well as Christianity, have the same golden rule at the heart of their faith, to do to others what you would have them do to you. And I see in the very recent proclamations of the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, and other faiths, the same determination that is shown by your joint public issues team with the other non-established churches, the view that our spiritual lives cannot fail to be social lives. Now, before I add some thoughts and set out my view of how men and women of faith can build on these injunctions to action, let me be clear, I'm not going to be party political in any way. Growing up as the son of a church minister, baptized into the faith, raised in the faith, listening twice every Sunday to sermons about the faith, I could not fail to be influenced by religious teaching. I was strongly influenced by my father's social Christianity, the ethic that no one should walk by ever on the other side. But my father recognized there were men and women of different political convictions in his congregation. He was careful to tell me about the risks of preaching in favor of one political viewpoint in preference to another, and he stressed the practical benefits of showing respect for the views and wisdom of other people. A colleague of his had another way out. The Sunday after an election in which his favored party won, he could not help himself. He would announce the first hymn as "Now Thank We All Our God." If the opposing party won, he would call for the hymn, "Dear Lord and Father of Mankind, forgive our foolish ways." If a third party came through or fared well, it would be God moves in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform. Now, our faith also teaches us something else my father warned me of, that no one should make claims of some moral superiority because of the faith. And we've come a long way from the 1920s and 30s, when a predecessor of mine as Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, drafted most of his speeches by hand before sending them to his office staff to check. And he would regularly inscribe on the margins of the page the phrase, "refer to AG." And upon seeing these notations, conscientious civil servants duly sought the advice of the Attorney General about the legal propriety of the relevant language. Invariably, the Attorney General replied he had nothing to add. And only after many months did the civil servants realize that the AG was not the Attorney General. And this was Baldwin leaving an aide-memoire for himself, that as he gave the speech, he should with great regularity invoke as inspiration and sustenance for his argument, AG, refer to Almighty God. But those who invoke God on their side are misusing religion. We cannot and shouldn't claim God is on our side, but only hope, as Lincoln said, that we are on God's side. We must approach our role with some humility, that we cannot impose our faith on others. To persuade people of what we think is right, we have to use tools of reasoning around which a consensus can be built and which can contrast with today's fake news and false truth. So what role can faith play? Faith gives us comfort. Faith gives us a community. Faith gives us courage. Faith helps us respond to suffering and loss. All of you will know someone who has brushed with death or died during the crisis. Most of us have lost someone close whom we knew and were related in some way to us. But our own critics, from agnostics to atheists, say that this consolation and comfort is all that religion can do to help us deal with suffering. You'll notice, like me, that after a murder or a flood or a calamity in a town or city which has led to loss of life, BBC cameras will go to the nearest church on the Sunday afterwards. Picture people going into church and report simply, "Prayers were said," perhaps playing back a sentence or two at most from the vicar. It is though the church were there to soften the blow, but there is no explanation of why. And yes, to many people, religion can best be described as something there for us to hold on to when things go wrong. But religion offers us, who have come face to face with unexpected tragedy, more than consolation, more than comfort. It builds a sense of community, and it also inspires us to resist worldly trends towards selfish individualism. We are part of a community of believers, and that community is part of us. More than that, faith gives us the courage to pursue what we believe in. Courage, Winston Churchill said, is the greatest quality of all, because upon it all else depends. We can be intelligent, wise, caring, compassionate, be full of good intentions, but without moral courage, that is to stand firm for your beliefs and to have the willpower to see things through, you will not achieve your aims. And in our generation, it is the courage to stand up against worldly trends towards selfish individualism that can change our society for good. The fact that our faith gives us purpose has been acknowledged by perhaps Europe's best-known living philosopher, Jürgen Habermas, who, after a lifetime putting forward the most rational and eloquent arguments as agnostic for secular liberalism, came to the conclusion that liberalism stripped of faith is quite unable to inspire people to bridge the gap between the world we have and the world we can build. Talking of what he called the motivational weakness of liberal states, he argues that they are unable to inspire virtuous acts. And he suggests that among the modern societies, only those that are able to introduce into the secular domain the essential contents of the religious traditions, which point beyond the mere human realms, will be able to rescue the substance of the human. He has understood that we are human beings who at our best can feel the pain of others, and at our best can believe in something bigger than ourselves. And in two ways, at home here in our own country, we can understand that too much individualism and not enough concern for the community damages us all. And when we look abroad, we can see that isolationism and protectionism also cuts across the best of human nature and prevents us cooperating with others to the benefit of us all. So what do I take out of the current crisis? a rising and hopefully soon unanswerable demand for dignity and for justice, and that gives us hope. Before the crisis, before COVID, or shall I say another before COVID BC, we were told that we could not buck the market, and that government, that's the community acting together, was the problem and not the solution. But when the government became lender of last resort, insurer of last resort for millions of people, employer of last resort with a furlough, the market maker of last resort, nobody can say anymore you can't buck the market. We found that markets need morals, that markets may be free, but they cannot be values free. And thus that markets have to be servants and not masters. And that what we decide to do together collectively as a national community and the values we impose on the market are far more important than relying on market forces alone. And we've come to recognize the importance of our greatest non-market institution that really does buck the market, the NHS, where we pool and share the risks so that irrespective of wealth, everyone is treated on the basis of need. And we put people first. And there's a bigger change. Before COVID, I'll call it before COVID BC, we put not just markets, but the rights of the individuals on a pedestal at the expense of our obligations to our community. Despite the fact we're members of families and groups shaped by our cultures and history, and we're part of a community, and as I said, a community is part of us. Remember that phrase, there is no such thing as society, only individuals. And so the balance has swung away from the collectivism of the post-war years to a new individualism that manifests itself in many forms: libertarianism, self-interest, the rejection of deference, suspicion of authority, the erosion of trust, the exhaustion of social capital, and generally a tendency to think not so much of what's best for the community or the public good, but what's best for ourselves. At the turn of the century, one major American academic study described people as so individualistic that they were bowling alone. By 2020, of course, millions were alone and not even bowling. But being physically isolated during 2020 has, it seems, made us more aware of the benefits of contact and communication. We've discovered we depend on each other more than we thought, that we value what is rooted and close to home more than the distantly networked. Being alone and being free to be ourselves within a culture that elevates personal autonomy now seems less attractive than a culture that encourages cooperation and celebrates reciprocity and the generosity of others. The celebration of Christmas 2020 brought this home to me. For most families, the burning issue was not anymore what presents they received as individuals, but simply how they could come together as a family. By indicating we prefer to cultivate and embed a sense of community over a hyper-individualism, we may now be able, after all, to say that there is indeed such a thing as society. And millions of us have found that we cannot be happy when so many millions are sad, at ease when so many are ill at ease, comfortable when others go without comfort, within a world in which rights and responsibilities are not distributed according to morally accepted standards. Indeed, we no longer want to live a life of spiritual meaninglessness and emptiness, which allows wrongs to go unrighted, evils to go unpunished. And we have to understand another bigger change. People now see that the dot-com, the gig economy, the 0 hours contract economy, they see it as one which created too much risk and left people uninsured and with too little security. So justice requires we build a new consensus around a new social contract across the generations and all social groups that properly and fairly values those who have during the crisis given the most but received the least. The health and social care workers who save lives, the transport workers who ensure supplies from oxygen to food reach our homes and hospitals, the caretakers who keep our workplaces safe, and public service workers and volunteers who've been there for us when we need them. Change there must be. We must widen our social nets, safety nets, construct new ladders of opportunities, remove the glass and other ceilings to progress. And it's not just about money, it's about respect and dignity, everyone to be treated as a first-class citizen. And also in the interest of fairness and social justice, it's time to say that it's not anti-wealth that those with wealth have a duty to help the not so wealthy. It's not anti-business and anti-enterprise to say that those who have succeeded in enterprise and business have a duty to help those who have not had the chance to show their enterprising. Eventually, of course, each country will find its own way forward as it rebalances the relationships between individuals and communities, between markets and states, between risk and security, between freedom and control, between the very rich and the rest, and of course between man and nature as we tackle COVID and our environmental crisis. But what of the global challenges we share in common? What of the relations between nations as we seek to address these challenges? It's a question Methodists address throughout your history, and you do so every day. And I want to suggest Globally, we are at a turning point, but we don't yet know whether history will or will not turn. So we know what's wrong. The question is, can we do what's right? As you say in Walking with Micah, the Methodist Principles for Social Justice, and I quote, "We live at a time of huge change when domestic and global injustices are being revealed and intensified. How can our world be renewed so that all God's creation, people and planet, can flourish?" And this is the question I want to grapple with for the rest of my remarks. And I will argue, to put it perhaps all too glibly, we don't just cooperate out of need. We have a human need to cooperate. For I start where we are today, here and now, and I want to pose the big questions that affect our whole world. Why have hundreds of thousands of lives been needlessly lost worldwide during the pandemic through a lack of equipment, medicine, and vaccines? Think of the contrast between the awe-inspiring cross-border medical and scientific cooperation to discover a vaccine, and yet the abject failure of political leaders to cooperate and work together. No early warning systems worth the name, no proper monitoring, no adequate exchange of information, no obligation on states to take remedial action, no sufficiently large reserves of drugs or even protective equipment, no agreement on how we share the burden of paying for what we desperately need, from ventilators to vaccines, all of which could have saved many of the lives now lost. And consider now, where we know no one is safe anywhere until everyone is safe everywhere. We know all of us will live in fear until no one lives in fear. And consider also, vaccines have become available that could immunize the whole world, but vaccine nationalism and medical protectionism has still taken hold. The last year will be remembered for our collective failure in the greatest peacetime crisis to come together as an international community. Remembered, as I said at the beginning, how our very openness, which should have been the platform for enhanced international cooperation, that openness instead became the channel through which disease spread across the world. But the pandemic raises even bigger questions about how we manage our planet. Why in the year 2021 we can't come together to prevent economic crisis, halt climate change, stop the new nuclear arms race, deliver the sustainable development goals which the whole world signed up to, every country, every institution, that would end illiteracy, extreme poverty, avoidable infant and maternal mortality. And how have we failed also to pay for this by making the tax avoiders pay up the billions they siphon off into the ungoverned spaces we call tax havens? Now, these are all complex questions requiring detailed inquiry in each area, but they have one characteristic in common. Like the pandemic, they are global problems that need global solutions. None can be solved by a single country, group, or individual, however powerful or rich, acting on their own. And yet there is a fundamental mismatch, a disjunction, a chasm between the global nature of these shared challenges like climate change and the primarily national approach within which we've organized ourselves to confront them. Perhaps nationalisms are today so strong and great power rivalries too great for us to rebuild the international system of decision-making in the way I want. But there are 5 major international events this year that are giving us the opportunity to begin to unwind the protectionism of the last decade and reactivate the international solidarity and cooperation we need. This weekend's G7 summit, which is concluding today, and the climate change COP26, which is also under a British presidency. And then August's Non-Proliferation Treaty talks under the United Nations. The United Nations General Assembly of September, which is the chance to review progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, and then the November G20 meeting chaired by Italy. All of these will test the capacity of our fractured world to address problems that cannot be solved without multilateral cooperation. Today's G7 meeting, the summit of the rich country, that usually makes headlines for their photocalls and their handshakes, but should also have been the launch pad for an era of international cooperation. I'm afraid we've yet to see the breakthrough in making a global minimum corporate tax end the days of tax havens and ensure there will be no hiding place for tax avoiders, and divert the money siphoned off to tax shelters to make it available to pay for health, education, and vital public services. Still much has to be done to deliver the kind of corporate tax rate we need. And the G7 summit was one venue where, with the world's richest countries sitting around the same table, we could have made a decision that could eventually halt COVID in its tracks. But while the G7 members have offered 1 billion vaccines, the world needs 11 billion. And I still hope they will agree over the next few weeks a burden sharing plan proposed by the leaders of Norway and South Africa, under which the richest countries pay the cost, 2/3 of it, of immunizing the poorest citizens of the poorest countries. And if we were to see a historic offer that guaranteed funding for global health, and if we could see support for a temporary patent waiver on vaccines, then the United Nations General Assembly a few months from now, which meets with 150 million additional people now in absolute poverty around the world, could be the occasion where we came together to renew our commitment to deliver the world's sustainable development goals by 2030. I cannot let this speech go by without arguing that the government reconsider the $4 billion cut in overseas aid, including cuts in the programs that are so brutal as pulling away the needle from a child whose life could be saved. It's time to fight the real enemy, and the real enemy is poverty and deprivation. You have argued in your new set of proposals for a society that welcomes the stranger, a society where the poorest and most marginalized are at the center, a planet where our environment is renewed. And for that, we need now a new commitment to economic and environmental justice. And we've got to avoid a two-speed global economy in which the rich and poor countries diverge. We need global fiscal and monetary coordination to ensure balanced growth, debt restructuring to enable low-income countries to recover, concerted investment in infrastructure that the IMF has shown would have synchronized at a massive trillion, indeed perhaps $2 trillion to world economic output. At least half of the new investment should be directed to job creation in the green economy of renewable energy, energy efficiency, sustainable transport and regenerative agriculture. And such an agreement in Italy in November could be the starting point for a successful COP26 climate change summit in Glasgow. It's great news that 60% of countries now have some sort of net zero and carbon goal. Cities, companies and charities have also made net carbon zero targets. But the commitments, and particularly the near-term commitments for the 2020s that the largest countries have made, are sadly not nearly sufficient to limit warming to the 1.5 degrees promised in the Paris Climate Agreement. So all of us, over the next few weeks, will have to play our part in raising COP26 level of ambition, first by proposing tougher near-term carbon reduction targets, and second by making good the promises made to low-income countries and the coastal states that would assist the transition to being green economies. And I set out most of these proposals in my book, 7 Ways to Change the World, which was published in the last 3 days. One of our most ambitious aims, and yours, is a world that actively works for peace. August will see the long postponed review of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and our aim must be to halt what is becoming a new nuclear arms race involving America, Russia and China, and also to address the very real risk that up to 6 Middle Eastern powers, like Saudi Arabia, not just Iraq, will seek at some point soon to become nuclear weapon states. When running for office, President Biden offered his support for a ban on nuclear tests and an end to the enrichment of uranium and plutonium. Mindful also of his promise to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in defense strategies, he has also set the scene for what I believe should be a historic offer to nuclear weapons powers, that all declare that they will not ever use nuclear weapons first, and that they will never use them at all unless attacked by nuclear weapons. Such a nuclear weapons policy, which is often called sole purpose and no first use, would end talk of proliferation and slow, indeed put into reverse, the nuclear arms race. And it can be done. Just remember 35 years ago, that first meeting between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. Reagan was, of course, having to be moved from his hardline views about the evils of communism. When he met Olof Palme, the mild-mannered Swedish Social Democrat, who was the Prime Minister of Sweden at the time, he said to his staff, "He's a communist, isn't it?" And the reply from the staff was, "No, Mr. President, he's an anti-communist." And Ronald Reagan replied, "I don't care what kind of communist he is." But when he met Gorbachev, so fascinated was he by Star Wars that he said to Gorbachev, "If an asteroid attacked us, would you help America?" "Of course," said Gorbachev. "We too," said Reagan. And a bond was formed that led to the historic agreement signed by Gorbachev and Reagan, representing the two powers with the weaponry to destroy humanity, that an agreement was made that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And this gave us hope. And it's hope that really matters. And this is where I want to conclude: the power of hope. Hope is more than the absence of despair. It is hope that provides us as human beings not just with the energy to get things done, but with purpose and a sense of direction. It's the bridge between what we are and what we have it in ourselves to become. As put by a French writer, an individual can survive for 40 days without food, 8 days without water, 8 minutes without air, but not for a second without hope. Immanuel Kant, when asked what were the 3 biggest questions in life for anybody seeking a meaningful existence, he said the first would be to know who I am. The second would be to know what I can do. But the third for him was, for what may I hope? And I think of the power of hope. And of what influenced me growing up in a small industrial town in Fife in Scotland. As a son of a Presbyterian minister, I was taught early on the words of one biblical text and soon knew it off by heart. Those that have hope shall renew their strength. They shall take wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Words that have stayed with me ever since about the power of hope and the energy and sense of purpose and direction it gives you. And I recalled the words about the importance of hope from an unexpected quarter from Albert Camus, the existentialist writer, whose existentialism had led him to reject for most of his life all the tenets of conventional morality. He met Simone de Beauvoir, Jean-Paul Sartre, Arthur Koestler, André Malraux, some of the great French literary figures in 1946 in the ruins of a world after a war that seemed to put us at absolute zero. And Camus is alleged to have said to them, didn't we get it all wrong when we said there was no such thing as moral values? And if we were to admit this, would not this be the beginning of hope? Camus, the existentialist, admitting the importance of moral values, showing our moral sense is the basis of hope. Hope so important to us that you can find writers, poets, musicians, all focusing on the power of hope. Think of perhaps the best film, Casablanca. Its script written at the outset of the Second World War by an anti-Nazi Jew. And when near the end, the French stand up to the Nazi overlords by defiantly singing the Marseillaise, they send out a message of hope to an often despairing wartime audience who can now hope of final victory. And think of the song, You'll Never Walk Alone, because again, it first appeared during the Second World War in the music carousel. And it was written again as an update, an upbeat message to give people hope, with its call to everyone who listened, even the desolate, to walk on with hope in your heart. And I'll never forget the story behind the great I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King that helped turn the tide in favor of civil rights in America in the 1960s. In it, he was setting out his ideal of a world where children of all races and religions would one day live together in harmony. Surprisingly, as we now know, Martin Luther King had not intended to refer to the dream or to mention it. It was not in his written notes, but he was struggling to enthuse his audience. And his friend, the gospel singer, Natalia Jackson, who was sitting near him, shouted out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." And a few moments later, as he took her advice and articulated the vision of a new world built on hope. Movements succeed, we have suggested, by demonstrating the power of possibility and by painting the bigger picture, illustrating what change should take place and why and how. And they do so by engendering hope. I think of recent tragedies where out of despair emerged hope. Think of Norway 10 years ago, when all of us were shocked in every part of the world, where more than 70 young people were shot dead by a neo-Nazi terrorist. But when Norway's Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg made a speech to the country, he quoted what one of the closest friends of a victim had said to him. She had said that if the hate of one person can do so much evil, consider how much love we can show if millions come together. And so Stoltenberg was able to say, we will answer hatred with love and give people hope. And think of the story and the conversation recounted by New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern when she too was faced with a terrorist set of murders of Muslims by a white supremacist. And she repeated the words of a bereaved Muslim relative who had said, "Peace be upon you." And she quotes this to call on New Zealanders to discharge what she called a responsibility to be the place that we wish to be, a place that is diverse, that is welcoming, that is kind and compassionate. A message of hope, and that's exactly what you're calling for with the 6 of your aims for our country, a politics characterized by listening, kindness and truthfulness. And today we face a new problem. Kent councillors just said it cannot accept more unaccompanied children coming from abroad, children who are now orphans with no place to call home and no one to call family. But we cannot give up on these children. And we have to win the public to accept our duty of care. And this was the aim that we had, you have, to take strangers in. And let's go back to 2015. Save the Children and others launched a campaign led by Kirsty McNeil to persuade the government that Britain should take in then hundreds of unaccompanied Syrian children. And their campaign dug deep into British values and traditions and explained that helping child refugees was not an aberration, but in the best of British traditions. They reminded the public of the Kinder transport of the late 1930s, when a British hero, Sir Nicholas Winton, had brought hundreds of Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe, saving them from Nazi persecution and Hitler's gas chambers by offering them a new life in Britain. And it was this narrative that won public opinion. It recalled our successes as a country and our values. A narrative that said we can do this because we've already done this and this is who we really are. It recalled also Danny Boyle's message about the best of British values. And as we live through this unprecedented pandemic and its economic consequences, let us recall the normally pessimistic Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Remember how in his book, The Gulag, he talked of the divide between good and evil, running not just through countries or communities, but through the human heart. A pessimistic message perhaps, but he also talked of what he called a bridgehead of good, when people became the best they could be. And we found in this crisis bridgeheads of good everywhere. Scientists are cooperating across borders to contain and cure disease, aid workers moving heaven and earth to get protective equipment to the poorest corners of the world, nurses and doctors risking their lives to save lives, the vaccinated in rich countries donating money to help the unvaccinated in poor countries, offering help to women, men, and children they would never meet and whose names, of course, they will never know, all proving by their actions a basic truth about human solidarity. As I said at the outset, we don't just cooperate out of need. We have a human need to cooperate. Yes, we can look round at a fractured world and be pessimistic. Indeed, Tennyson, the great British poet, wrote late in life a poem, Locksley Hall, 40 Years On. And in it were the words, "O cosmos, chaos, or chaos, cosmos, when will it ever end?" But Gladstone, who was then the UK Prime Minister, reminded him that one of his first poems he had ever written was not Locksley Hall, 40 Years On, but the original poem, Locksley Hall. And the words in that Gladstone relayed to him, dipped into the future as far as the eye could see, and saw the vision of a world and the wonder it could be. And this is also Tennyson, the poet who wrote in Ulysses, that our task was always to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. That's it, not yielding to prejudice, xenophobia, isolation, or selfishness, but striving all the time and without ceasing to be the best we can possibly be, in tune with the values and beliefs we hold in common. And your religion, faith, and denomination suggests at all times that we build a healthier, safer, greener, fairer, and more compassionate world.
If we were in a church hall now, we'd be able to hear enthusiastic applause. And thank you very much indeed for that lecture, Gordon. Such a comprehensive lecture and such encouragement, both for what the Methodist Church has done, but also what we can be part of. I also love the view that we could see over your shoulder. I'm sorry you can't hear the applause of appreciation. I'm not sure if you've got your camera on, if I could invite you to switch your camera. That's lovely. Great. Now, during your lecture there, we were having question after question flooding in that my colleagues have been sending on to me. I hope you've got about 8 hours to spend with us now. We can try and get through some of them. But if you don't mind, I'd just like to steal the chair's privilege and start off with a question of my own, if I may. As you know, as you referred to, Methodists are trying very hard to work for climate justice, both in our own communities, but also recognising, as you say, the urgency of international action. But I read your book yesterday. I speed read your book, which I must recommend. It's very, very good. But you also make the case there for the need for economic growth to aid recovery from COVID and to progress the Sustainable Development Goals, which have been knocked back so much by the pandemic. But as we know, global economic growth is very closely linked to negative environmental consequences, not just greenhouse gas emissions, but also global threats such as land conversion and desertification, biodiversity loss, increased material use. In countries such as the UK, is it time for the era of ever-increasing consumption to come to an end?
I think you're asking the big question about how do you combine social justice, economic prosperity, and environmental stewardship. And you know, when I started off as a finance minister, people were talking only about social justice and economic prosperity, and sometimes not even about social justice. But environmental stewardship is such a big part of what we do that we've got to get this right. Now, I don't believe that we should accept that the economy cannot grow. What I believe we should accept is that we've got to have carbon-free growth. In other words, we've got to reorientate the economy away from this use of carbon towards a far more environmentally sustainable methods of production, whether that be concrete or whether that be the use of oil, gas, and coal. And so the real task is to eliminate the polluting substances from the production processes as far as we can. And what I tried to set out in the book actually is 4 things that I think could be done immediately, and I'll be very brief. One is companies have got to disclose their carbon footprints. They've got a duty to tell us what impact they're having on the environment. And once we knew, then we could choose not to invest in them or choose also not to work with them. Secondly, we've got, in my view, to have an environmental New Deal. So in other words, we need to spend money now building a sustainable infrastructure that is not based on carbon and not based on pollution. Thirdly, we've got to think about nature itself. And so it's not just planting trees, but it's also having a more resilient environment in countries where really we've got to make the agriculture, we've got to make the industries, the use of oceans far less polluted. And then finally, we've got to help pay for the poorest countries to be able to mitigate and adapt. So all these 4 things are possible. I'm not going to go out to say to people that we will produce less. Now, the question then is, will we consume less? Now, these are personal choices. And I think people are making their personal choices every day, but we've got to get the facts before people about what the consumption of particular good means for the environment. And instead of saying, I'm going to ban this or ban that, I think what we've got to do is get the information out to people about what their consumption actually does, whether it's petrol or whether it's particular kinds of packaging they use or anything else, what it does for the environment. So we've got to give people the choice, I think, and in some cases we'll have to legislate, but we've got to get growth that is non-polluting growth. And I think that's really what the aim should be over the next few years. I've lost you.
Teach myself to unmute. A number of questions have come in, not surprisingly, about the G7, and you've been very active speaking out about what you hoped the G7 would do. I think you've been a little bit disappointed, but let me just ask you the questions, if I may. David Bennett asks, you claim that the G7 hasn't committed enough vaccines for poorer countries. Realistically, what would you like to see done? And then a wider question, I don't have a name for. As you look at the events of the weekend in Cornwall, do you see signs that leaders have stood up to trends of individualisation, felt the pain of others and contributed towards the greater good?
I'm not going to criticise the good intentions, but I don't think we've had the right answers. I mean, 11 billion vaccines are needed if we're going to vaccinate the world. Here are the richest countries in the world sitting around the table. It's the one organization that could actually make the decision to pay for these vaccines. They're not that expensive. We save money if we actually get the economy back to work because people are vaccinated. And anyway, all these governments are getting money because we're creating new international money through the International Monetary Fund. Britain's about to be paid $23 billion by the IMF. So the rich countries sitting around the table could have had a plan that would vaccinate the whole world. Now, instead, what they did was agree we will dose share. So the excess doses in Britain and America will be passed on to poorer countries. Now, that's a good thing. And it's great that that's being done, but it adds up to less than 1 billion doses. and we need to plan for 11 billion. So you're only dealing with a fraction of the problem. And yet the richest countries could have come up with the money that would have vaccinated the whole world. In other words, they put up $5 billion. The whole vaccination and the protection program, which includes testing and also, of course, equipment like protective equipment, costs about 50 billion. So they came far short of what most people who know what needs to be done are doing. And that's a huge failure. It's a moral failure, because here you're faced with ethical issues about who is going to live and who's going to die. I mean, the people who are not going to be vaccinated have got a real risk of dying. You've got health workers in Africa who are not being vaccinated and won't be for months. You've got the vulnerable in every continent who are not being vaccinated. So this summit is choosing who lives and who dies. And I can't go away with anything other than saying this is a moral lapse. It's a failure. 1 million people are dying every 3 months, and we could have stopped that far more quickly than we're going to be able to do.
Thank you. Another issue that you refer to in your book, which has changed, I think, since it went to the publishers, is the question around tax justice.
Yes.
This is one that you identify in your book, and you have worked on for many years, and we'll be aware that there was an agreement that happened last week around minimum taxation levels. The question that's come in is, has this recent agreement answered the demands of the tax justice movement? If so, how? If not, why not?
Well, I don't think it
and
has.
What's the next step?
I was involved in this in 2009 when we had the summit to deal with the economic crisis then, and we tried to get an agreement that countries would isolate all these tax havens and sanction them if they didn't do the right thing and charge proper rates of tax, or stop siphoning off companies' money to their tax havens and preventing us getting the revenues in to pay for health and everything else. So what happened last weekend was that they agreed that there would be a global corporate minimum tax rate. That's a good thing, that there's going to be a corporate minimum tax rate to be charged in all parts of the world. But it's too low, because at 15%, you still will go to the tax haven when the British rate's going to be 25%, the American rate's 28%. And so instead of the revenues coming to Britain, these revenues will go to these tax havens, and the companies who use the tax havens will not have to pay 25 or 28, they simply have to pay 15%. And then we found there was all these loopholes. So Amazon, which has a percentage profit that's lower than perhaps Apple, it wouldn't be required to pay tax at all, it seems to me, from this. And then, of course, there's all sorts of other sort of loopholes that mean that companies are really not being taxed where they're making the money. They're being taxed where they choose to have their nameplate company. So you set up a nameplate company in Seychelles or St. Kitts and Nevis, and you can actually tax yourself there, but almost no tax at the moment, maybe 15% in a few years. But of course, you're escaping the real taxation that you should pay, that everybody else in Britain is paying 20% income tax, 40 or 45%, and these companies will pay at most 15%, and the individuals, but of course, they've got all these loopholes as well that we've still got to deal with. So it was a progress that we now have an agreement on a minimum tax rate, but we're not going to get the revenue. My plan in the book is for revenues of nearly $1 billion a year. What we're going to get is maybe 250 million, which is a billion, which is a quarter of that. So it's too little, and it's probably not going to even be that sum when all the waivers and all the loopholes are there. So we've got to do better than that. But look, everybody can protest. There's going to be a G20 meeting in October. We should push that they actually make the decision, and perhaps the decision shouldn't be the rich countries. It should be all countries involved in that decision through the United Nations. And
I'm sure the tax justice movement and churches for tax justice will be enabling us to protest in advance of the G20.
I'm sure.
Before we move away from financial issues, I wonder if I could ask you about GDP. This relates slightly back to the environment and economy question earlier on. GDP, as we know, gross domestic product, which is the way that we measure our flourishing, as it were, as an economic community. Do you have a suggestion of a better way of measuring human flourishing than GDP?
Well, I was the finance minister, for 10 years. And, they say about finance ministers, there's only two kinds of finance ministers. There are those who fail, and there are those who get out just in time. And it's a really difficult job. And we did look at all these things, how you could republish, if you like, the national accounts to value voluntary activity, to value health in a better way, to value well-being and all these things. And yes, I think there will be advances, but you're going to have to get an international agreement on this. Otherwise, people will be marked down for taking one thing seriously and others don't. But it does still come back to these issues. Are you going to do enough for employment? Are you going to do enough for healthcare? Are you going to do enough for your social safety nets and for the protection against poverty? And it will always still come back to these issues. And these are moral choices. You know, I've always said a budget is a moral document, because when you publish a budget, you're setting out your view about the relationship between rich and poor, the relationship between those who can provide for themselves and those who can't. And I still think whatever your GDP measure is, you do come back to these central questions. Are you going to create jobs for those who need it? Are you going to create public services for those who depend on them? Are you going to, if you like, remove the inequalities between rich and poor? These questions will still arise under any form of GDP.
Thank you. Another of the 7 areas where you identified that we need to fix, we need change, was the halting of the nuclear arms race. And it's so heartening to hear you say that. So often we just don't talk about it. And the churches have been hugely behind the United Nations Treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which was ratified in January, although, as you know, not signed by the UK. Your focus is more on talking around getting countries to state that they will not use first strikes, or that there is a solo purpose for the use of nuclear weapons. Now, the treaty itself came from non-nuclear countries, so the countries that were fed up with the way that things were being done because it had failed. Why do you think this way that you suggest is better than another United Nations treaty?
Because the nuclear weapon states are the people that have got to disarm. We've got to persuade. John F. Kennedy, I think I quoted him in another context, say we've got to abolish these weapons before they abolish us. So we've got to focus on those nuclear weapon states who have got to change the policy. Otherwise, we will have more nuclear weapon states like Iran's or Saudi Arabia or other countries in the Middle East. And we are in a new nuclear arms race. I think we're too complacent about this, because we're building new nuclear weapons at an incredible rate. Britain has just decided, for whatever reason I do not understand, to increase its nuclear warheads. We were reducing them. And of course, China and Russia and America are getting ever more sophisticated weapons. So the reason I focus on the nuclear weapon states is they are the people who've got to disarm. So what can they do? Now, it's fascinating that Joe Biden, he was involved in the initial talks with Gorbachev and Reagan in the 1980s. So he's been in this for a long time. He's said he wants to stop nuclear testing. Now, that would be a big advance, because that would mean that new weapons were not going to be developed. He wants to stop the enrichment of uranium and plutonium. Now, that's really important also, because that's the issue with Iran at the moment. And then I've got this idea that he could actually say, if America offered that we will not use nuclear weapons first, and unless we're attacked by nuclear weapons, we'll never use them at all, that'd be a big advance. You know, I go back to this Russian-American agreement in the 1980s. It did create the International Space Station. As a result of that agreement, every few hours, this International Space Station is going above our heads and crossing the world. And amazingly, in that space station is a Russian astronaut and an American astronaut. There's always a Russian and an American. And they are cooperating in space, even though there are daggers drawn everywhere else. And I keep saying, if we can cooperate in the outer heavens, where for years there was a space race, surely we can cooperate better on Earth. So things can be done. They were done in the 1980s, not enough, too many weapons now, we've got to reduce them. But the only way that can be done is getting the nuclear weapon states to do something. So while I applaud the countries that have passed the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons Treaty, it will only succeed if the nuclear weapon states are persuaded or pressurized or realize that this is a self-defeating policy to increase nuclear weapons.
Great. I think we'd encourage you to keep pushing on that.
Yeah.
We've had a number of questions about the church's involvement in politics and how Christians themselves can be involved. So perhaps I could just throw a few to you. You've obviously been at the receiving end of quite a lot of campaigns and things that the churches have tried to say and do. Could you give us an idea of what has impact? How can we be more effective in what we're doing as churches?
Well, I think on many issues, churches have been incredibly effective. If you go to America, it's usually on personal moral issues like abortion and other issues like that. In Britain, I think it's more to do with social change. And I think people realize that churches can have an impact on the kind of society. One of the great privileges I had was to have all the denominations of the churches together when we launched our attempt to end child poverty in 2005. And so all the different denominations came together, and they didn't see it as a political issue. They saw it as a moral issue. And so where there are issues about how we can change society for the better, where we can all come together, I think we should recognize that it's usually a social movement that brings people together, that shows the power of us all together, that is the big picture sort of presented, that will have success. And sometimes campaigning on your own, and sometimes campaigning, no matter how good the cause is, you can't get through to people. You've got to find a way of bringing people together. I think this Crack the Crisis that you're involved in, and I know that many other groups are involved in, is one way of trying to bring everybody together. So a social movement, in my view, will worry a politician when the scale of it becomes really important, in that thousands of the constituents may be prepared to take up that issue. So that's where I would try and unite with as many, and you do it with your public issues team, unite with so many organizations as possible to push for something that can be achievable. And you know, when I was dealing with Live Aid and Drop the Debt and Jubilee 2000 and what we did for the G7 for 2005, what rather surprised me was that we had these great movements that came together. We had great demonstrations, and then they dissipated. So I think social movements have got to be able to stay in being as well. Instead of being one-off, single issue, I think you've got to stay in being and just fight things through. Because even if you don't succeed the first time, and we haven't succeeded entirely on vaccination this time, we could succeed later just by keeping the pressure up. So I would hope that social movements could be more comprehensive, bring more people together, and at the same time be sustained and not be just for one campaign. And I think that would make the biggest difference.
One of the bits I particularly enjoyed in your book was the section on what should I do, why should I be involved, and your response around being part of a movement and the importance of social movements, and how to do that. You need to tell the big story, you need to tell the big picture, and you'd think churches would be good at that.
Yes, and you are normally, I think.
Not always.
Every sermon that I had from my father always had what he called illustrative material, that you had to tell a story. You can't just have a slogan. You can't just have a soundbite. I suppose blessed are the poor is a soundbite, but you've got to have a story about what it is that poverty is doing to people and what difference you can make. And I think the stories that we tell are really, really important. And, you know, when I was mentioning earlier, my friends Jens Stoltenberg and Jacinda Ardern, who are prime ministers or were prime minister in New Zealand, Norway and New Zealand, when they brought the nation together, and I wish I'd been able to do it better than I was able to, particularly during the financial crisis, but when they brought people together in the midst of tragedy, they told a story. They didn't say, I believe. They said, I've been talking to the victims and I've been talking to people who are bereaved, and this is what they're telling me. And this is the story that they want communicated through you. And I think that had far more power than anything that they could have said individually on their own. So tell a story, but please campaign. I mean, I used to tell the story that when we were doing the Jubilee debt campaign, all these letters were arriving in the Treasury. And then one of the civil servants found this petition letter, and it'd come from my own mother. And I didn't know she'd sent it. But of course, my mother was so keen that we didn't waste any money that she said, no, you don't need to bother replying. Don't waste the money on a stamp, but I'm telling you what you should do. So these letters do make a difference.
That's fantastic. And in terms of stories, we have just had a comment in saying when Gordon was Chancellor, he brought in family tax credit, and it was this that kept my own children and me out of poverty, and I'd like to thank him. So I'll just pass that on,
That's very
as
nice.
well as the difficult questions we like asking you. Just
Well, I
pass
hope our
that on.
children are flourishing, because that was what we tried to do to stop poverty, but we didn't properly explain it enough. And so people didn't know and didn't understand it. You know what a tax cut is, and you know what a social security benefit is, but a tax credit was difficult to explain, because it was actually saying you don't pay tax, the taxman actually gives you money, and we never got it across. So instead of popular support that I wanted, because we were taking millions of pensioners and children out of poverty, people didn't quite understand what we were trying to do, and that was a failure of communication on my part.
Can I move on to another area now? Two questions. Somebody says, justice isn't complete without racial justice. What are your thoughts on this in terms of the challenges the church faces today? But then also, as we've seen the UK begin to grapple with its history of slavery and the wealth that it brought into the country, can we still argue against reparations for the nations and people that face structural inequality because of the legacy of the British Empire?
Yeah, I was dealing, when I was Prime Minister, with questions of reparations, and there has to be reparations in particular cases where discrimination, exploitation, and in some cases violence is proven. So we have to think about that. I mean, I'm worried about what I think people now call culture wars. You know, I want to see the country unite. I think, as I mentioned, Danny Boyle's 2012 Olympics message about all the things that brought our country together: liberty, tolerance, fairness, social responsibility. Every issue that comes up, we should be asking ourselves, I mean, are these the values that we want to project? Is this the unity that is possible? Because sometimes you see people just raising an issue. I mean, I raised the issue earlier a few days ago, when Marcus Rashford called for the government, or called for people to support the England football team, and said, look, we are trying to, you can disagree with all sorts of things, but the main message we're trying to get across is we've got to fight racism. And then Downing Street was silent for a few days about supporting him, and looked as if they weren't supporting him. I mean, surely we can unite around our opposition to racism. And instead, some people want to make that culture a culture war, that you divide the country over whether you support taking the knee or not. That surely is really not where we ought to be. So we've got, now these are symbolic things, because obviously the big issues are inequality and employment opportunity, inequality and social conditions, and we've got to address them. But we've got to address them by being a far more united country. And I feel that the English football team is a very good example of where you have a racial equality, where people accept that this is a team representing the whole country, and it's multiracial, and that's a fantastic thing. So I think we've got to stand up for our principles. We've got to show that we can unite around supporting racial equality, and we mustn't allow these culture wars to divert us by taking sometimes a very small issue and then blowing it up simply to polarize the country between those who support this cultural tradition and those who don't. Let's get back to the bigger picture, which is fighting for equality and unifying around that, and particularly around British values that we think have been significant in the past and could unite us in the future.
So what would you say would be the biggest things that we could do to increase racial equality in this country, which we know has just been exposed by the pandemic?
Well, look at the jobs opportunities available in certain communities. Look, I think there's probably 1 million young people who are not working at the moment. I think the figures are not accurate. I think there are so many young people sitting at home doing nothing. There are so many who are not on training or employment programs. There's so little being done with this job restart program. It's called Kickstart, but there's only, 30,000 maybe young people on it, and there's 1 million young people looking for work. Now, the chances of being unemployed as a young person, if you're Black or if you're from an ethnic community, are twice and sometimes 3 times as high. We've got to deal with these inequalities in educational and employment opportunity. I was just talking the other day to someone about access to universities and colleges. We're not publicizing the fact that we want people from the poorest communities and the communities which have got obviously a large proportion of people who've never had a tradition of their family going to university. We're not even publicizing enough. These opportunities should be available. So there are big structural changes we need to make. and they're about employment, they're about education, they're about opportunity in general. And of course, wherever there is discrimination, wherever there's sectarian behavior, we've got to banish it at the first opportunity.
Thank you. You spoke very powerfully about the role of Alf Dubs and the Kindertransport and the moves that were made around, well, that weren't fully successful in the end, unfortunately, around allowing unaccompanied child refugees into this country. And then you talked about the problems in Kent that were being highlighted again. We're just beginning Refugee Week, as you'll know, at the moment. How do you think that Methodist Christians and anyone else who happens to be listening in should best respond to the government's new plan for immigration? What actions for justice should we take?
Well, first of all, on the unaccompanied children, I mean, Kent County Council wants to help. It's not that they don't want to help, it's just they don't have the money. So we've got to help give them the resources to be able to do this. You see, the interesting thing about that campaign was, you know, normally we would have said, look at the condition of these children. Look how unfortunate their position is, because they've lost their family and they've got no home. And we would concentrate on how bad things were. What this campaign successfully did, I think, because there was some success, they didn't achieve everything, was concentrate not so much on what's wrong, but on what our values are. And so it's appealing to the best in human nature. And I think we've really got to do that when we're running many of the campaigns we're doing, because yes, you know, when we talk about vaccination, for example, I'm appealing to enlightened self-interest and saying, look, if we don't vaccinate the rest of the world, then Britain may turn out to have a third, fourth, fifth wave of the disease. But I'm also appealing to people's altruism, their concern about other people, that put themselves in other people's shoes and show empathy and solidarity. And that must be the same way we approach the whole question of immigration. I mean, you've got no alternative but to manage migration. It can't be completely uncontrolled, but it's got to be based on fair principles. And I think what people doubt is whether the principles on which this present new policy on immigration are fair. And I think we've got to always test any system like a migration system. Is it fair? Is it actually being unfair in particular to people of a particular ethnic background? Is it being unfair to people who are coming from a particular part of the world? And I think when we look at this, we would criticize some of the measures that have been adopted. Again, why worry? I worry about immigration, that it's a culture war, that you just shout out that here is a problem and therefore you polarize the country around this. We've got to get back to talking about this in terms of fairness and in terms of building a stronger community.
Thank you. This is a bit of a sideways question. Do you think I can't even say it, AI, artificial intelligence, robotics and the like, changes the dynamics of how we can deliver a just society?
I think it helps, and I think it's got dangers as well. And I'm trying to answer some of these questions, and there may be people in this audience that are far more up on this than I am. But what I understand, artificial intelligence, the danger is it becomes what's called augmented intelligence. That if you're highly educated and you're wealthy, you can use artificial intelligence, and that will increase inequalities in our society. My concern is how we can use artificial intelligence and technology generally to help those people who are in danger of being left behind, who've got potential and never have a chance to realize it. Now, in my role for the United Nations, I can see the potential of what they call high-tech, high-touch education. In other words, you use technology so that with artificial intelligence, you can measure and follow the progress of an individual. So you can give them individualized, personalized tuition on the basis of knowing the progress at which they're moving, the pace at which they're learning, and the difficulties that they're finding. And that can all be better measured because of the technologies that we have available to us. But you still need the teacher. The teacher is the tutor. So it's the combination of high tech and high touch, as they call it. So it's the combination of the technology and the teacher as tutor that makes the difference. So huge potential, I think, huge opportunities. In health, I can imagine great opportunities as well. I'm thinking about education, but huge opportunities to follow and to track and to improve the progress of every individual child, and to give people personalized learning, which would make the huge difference. But obviously, there are dangers if it just increases inequality, because I've got access or you have access. your intelligence is going to be augmented because you have access to this new technology that enables your own skills to be developed at the expense of other people who can't master this technology or don't have access to it. So there are dangers, but there's also opportunities.
Brilliant, thank you. Just a couple more questions and then I'm afraid we need to finish. Given the acute urgency of climate breakdown and the associated environmental degradation, what can churches do to ensure that the COP26 meeting in November, the United Nations meeting in November, does not fail us and does not fail the planet?
So there's got to be ambition. I don't think the ambition for this meeting amongst the politicians is high enough. And I think you'll see if you read the communique. I've just read the communique from the G7, that they want the COP to be successful. And of course, the intentions are all good. I'm not doubting people's good intentions, but you've got to then do the things that are necessary to make the thing a success. And so you've got to ratchet up the commitments. Now, everybody's quite happy, by the way, to give a commitment that I'll be net carbon zero by 2050 or 2060, because you don't think that you're having to make the difficult choices now. You can make them later. What we need to do is persuade people they've got to make the difficult choices now, and they've got to get carbon out of the system in the next few years. And we're off track. Every major country's off track. You know, I think it's true to say that if we are going to meet the net carbon zero target, then every day we would be having to have as little use of carbon and as little use of the economy, if you like, in being, as we did on the worst day of the pandemic when nobody was working. And so that's the sort of measure of the target we've got. We've got to take carbon out of the economy in the way that not working actually did for a few months during the crisis. So one, they've got to step up their ambition. But secondly, and everybody I've been talking to has told me this, the coastal states and the poorest countries feel very let down. In 2009 at Copenhagen, which was mentioned earlier, there was a huge row about all sorts of things, but we did promise to create a climate fund to help the poorer countries. And it was to be 100 billion. And I chaired meetings when I was in charge to get that money. But what I find is that even 10 years on, that money hasn't come in yet. And so you can't have a meeting when it's one person, one vote. You know, one country has an equal vote to every other country, when the coastal states and the poorest countries are being told we haven't honored our promises. So we're going to have to honor our promise. So if I was campaigning at the moment, and I will be, of course, but if I was trying to bring people together, I would say two issues. Ratchet up the commitments now, so we show we're serious, and don't leave it till 2040 or 2050, because nobody will believe you. And secondly, make sure that you start COP26 in good faith by honoring the commitment we made 10 years ago, and then continuing to honor that during the 2020s, when we need $100 billion a year to help the poorest countries mitigate and adapt to climate change.
Thank you. And the churches will certainly be engaged and involved and are already in campaigning towards.
You've got a youth campaign on this as well.
We have. It's great. Yes. So as a final question, thank you so much for coming along today, which, as you know, is launching our Walking with Micah project. It's a 2-year project. It's not a very long project, but what might be your dream for our church, working with others? What might we practically be able to accomplish through our renewed commitment to justice?
Well, if over the next few months at the United Nations review of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, we make progress, you know, we're not going to abolish nuclear weapons overnight, but we are going to remove many of them, and we are going to reduce the power of nuclear weapons in defense strategies, and we are going to end proliferation, which is dangerous, and we're going to halt the buildup of a nuclear arms race. Now, we've got to do that over the next few months. So when I set out these 5 big meetings, we should have a target for each meeting, and we should work together, and there should be a big movement formed. And even if we can't meet and have demonstrations, at least you can actually show through the power of emails and communications. If I was still Prime Minister, I'd be worried if there was 10,000 emails coming in asking me to do something. And that's the sort of power that different faith groups, by working together, to have, and it could raise to 100,000 or 1 million over time. So I would focus on the nuclear reduction of nuclear weapons. I would focus on COP26 and the objectives that I'm suggesting we set. And I would focus obviously on the reduction of poverty around the world, which we haven't really mention as much as I'd like, because you've got a humanitarian disaster in our midst, and sometimes we forget there are 25 million refugees. There are more than 80 million people who are displaced. That's more than the population of the United Kingdom. These figures are higher than at any time in our history. And, you know, I told a story in the book, and I just want to end with it, because I do want to end on a note of optimism, but I do want people to understand there were a group of teenage refugees in the Moria camp, and this is in Europe, in Greece, 3 years ago. And their position was so desolate that they'd given up completely, that they attempted suicide. And I thought, how could a teenager at that point in their lives, where everything should be ahead of them and there should be opportunity and possibility, how can we allow people to get into that situation? You know, hope dies when a convoy's lost at sea, or hope dies when a beleaguered town can't get its supplies, or when a hospital doesn't have doctors or equipment. But hope dying when there's no opportunity. We've got to change that. So I go back to this bridgehead of good. The bridgehead of good is, we've seen around the world people doing great things during this pandemic. We've seen that the old ideas that there's no such thing as society don't work. We've seen that things can actually change when people of goodwill come together. And we now need, I think, to build social movements. And I think that's what you're doing, actually. I think your 7 principles are about building a social movement based on hope. And I think we could actually effect real change. So young and old, people of different denominations, people, of course, of different social backgrounds coming together for clear purposes. I think what happened at the G7 is interesting, that we didn't get our act together quickly enough to make 1 or 2 demands the centerpiece of what we're doing. But I think if we did in these other conferences this year, we could actually make a difference. And I'm trying not to bring party politics into it, and I'm trying not even to bring politics into it, because I think this is about common sense. It's about people of goodwill. It's about communities coming together. And I do think this is possible. We've realized the limits of individualism during this crisis. We now know the power that communities can have if people come together. And I think we should now think of how we can mobilize that power, the hope that that gives for change. And that seems to me to be what you're trying to do. And I want to support you in everything you're doing.
Gordon Brown, thank you so much for your lecture, and also for being so willing to engage in conversation. I've really enjoyed the privilege of being able to talk to you like this.
The privilege for me, thank you.
Thank you. To close the lecture and to offer thanks to Mr. Brown, I'd like to introduce Jude Levermore, who is the Head of Mission for the Methodist Church.
Mr. Brown, I want to thank you for your deep commitment to issues of justice and for your personal leadership. You're a living embodiment, an encouragement to us to use what influence and power we have for good, to be tenacious, to be honest, to speak up and to speak out. And so thank you. It was a joy for those of us who are Methodists to call to mind again those on whose shoulders we stand, and thank you for reminding us of them. We're a smaller denomination now, but we know that small does not always equal weak. We recognise in all we can the value held in small on-the-ground agencies who can really make a difference. When you're smaller, you're more likely to work with others, and we're noticing more and more that we're called into collective action with partners ecumenically. And part of the ecumenical action is demonstrated in us being part of JPIT. But in addition, during this pandemic, we have heard countless stories of people of faith joining together in mission to bring about change and transformation in communities, and we celebrate that. We're excited about church at the margins because we know the small and marginalised is often where hope starts. And we celebrate too all that MHA, Methodist Homes, did during the COVID crisis, not just to care beautifully and sacrificially for residents and staff, but to speak out bravely when needed. And we are small, yes, but right now we're trending on Twitter, so thank you for that. We're called to look forward. We're learning the value of reflecting on the past in the present for the sake of the future. And you're so right to draw us to hope. In our line of work, hope is what keeps us going. And as I learned my faith, I was taught that apologetics meant the ability to give an account for the hope that is in us, the ability to give an account for my hope, the power of story, of testimony. Our hope is built on the gospel, which promises to be good news to the poor. Our hope is built on God as revealed to us in Christ and as lived out with the Spirit's help. To give an account for that hope means we as the church must work out again in this generation what that hope looks and sounds like in our times. And you've reminded us that we're not alone in that. The calling of the Methodist Church is to respond to the gospel of God's love in Christ and to live out its discipleship in worship and mission, to live it out for the sake of the world now. Our way of life commits us to worship, to learning and caring, to acts of service, and to speaking our faith to our neighbours, telling them about the dream, as Martin Luther King might have said. That's how we're called to live. A few years ago now, our young people called on us as a church to be more courageous. That was, as you put it, BC, before COVID, and is often the case with young people. They were prophetic, and we need courage now as we're to speak out. If we're going to be that growing, evangelistic, inclusive church of diverse people who speak of and listen for and live out the goodness of God, we need courage. As Jeremiah Wright, picked up by Barack Obama, pointed out, we need the audacity to hope, to be a bridgehead of good. So thank you. Thank you for encouraging us on that journey this evening. And if I might, I'd like to share a blessing for you, for all of us really, a reading from Romans chapter 15. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that you may abound in hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. Thank you.
Thank you, Jude. And that brings us to the end of our lecture this evening. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you for asking all the questions. I'm really sorry we didn't get to all of them. Thank you again, Gordon, for your time and your input this evening. And thank you to everyone behind the scenes who always make these webinars work. Can I encourage you to sign up at the Walking with Micah page on the Methodist Church website, methodist.org.uk, if you'd like to find out more about being a justice-seeking church. And another date for your diary, if you are into lectures, is Monday the 28th of June at 8 o'clock, when Professor Jason Leach, who's the National Clinical Director of Scotland, is going to be giving the Beckley Lecture at the Methodist Conference on faith and leadership in a global pandemic. And of course, you'll probably have heard him on the radio talking a lot about Scotland and their experiences during the COVID crisis. Thank you for coming, and hopefully we'll see you back here next year for another Methodist Justice lecture. Good night and God bless.